The late great Whitney Houston sang, "I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way." I'm looking forward to you doing just that. Over the decades, the United Nations has developed, negotiated and signed and sealed dozens of international human rights treaties. Some of these focus on particular categories of human rights, political and civil rights, or economic and social rights. Other treaties, though, are framed around the specific bearer of those rights. There is a treaty on women's rights, for people with disabilities. Indigenous peoples have a declaration of their rights. While all these agreements and treaties have garnered widespread support, they pale in comparison to the support given to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Concluded and signed in 1989, this Convention on the Rights of the Child was speedily supported by countries from across the globe. In fact, the Child Rights Convention enjoys unanimous, truly universal support amongst the countries of the world. Well, except for one country. One country remains a holdout and has refused to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Any guesses? If you said the United States, you'd be right. Nevertheless, this level of support is unmatched by any other human rights treaty. Despite that, and despite Whitney's wise words, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights tends to overlook children and their rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, lays out several child-specific rights, including their right to be heard in decisions impacting them. Yet seemingly, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights do not. This behooves us to devote some time to zero in on children's rights and business. How much more so because in many respects it is our children and future generations that will suffer from corporate activities and choices of companies operating today. I have in mind carbon emissions and combating climate change, the overexploitation of natural resources and the deliberate marketing of products to minors. For starters, children are not waiting for us adults to take action on these issues, which have all been characterised by scholars, by the way, as abuses of children's rights. Children like Greta Thunberg and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of others have taken to the streets in the school strike for climate action, for example. Other kids have actually sued companies for violating their rights, taken them to court. What's the violation? The continued emission of carbon and the burning of fossil fuels is destroying children's right to life, development and a healthy environment. Put that way, climate change is a human rights issue. Climate change is a business and human rights issue. While tackling it may be the greatest challenge of our generation, framing it as a rights issue also leads us to the question of what are business's obligation to protect our children's rights to a healthy environment and future. Should oil companies cease and desist as a matter of human rights? Viewing business's human rights responsibility through a child rights lens also leads us to different conversations and different human rights concerns. Has a company adopted a reasonable paid parental leave policy? Do they have child and family-friendly working arrangements for working parents? Children are also caught up in global supply chains themselves, and instances of child labour are all too common. According to the International Labour Organization, over 150 million children are victims of child labour, including 1 in 5 African kids. 50 years before Whitney was Janusz Korczak, one of my personal human rights heroes. Korczak was the principal at an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland during World War II, an orphanage that housed hundreds of Jewish children. One day in 1942, the Nazis came knocking, demanding all the children come outside to be deported. By that time, everyone understood that deported meant certain death. Given his stature in society, the guards allowed him to stay behind. He refused. And instead, Korczak proudly stood side by side with his children, all the way to their death in the Treblinka extermination camp. Why? It was simple. For Korczak, children must be cherished because children are humanity's hope for the future. Children are not the people of tomorrow, Korczak says, but are people of today. They have a right to be taken seriously and to be treated with tenderness and respect. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The unknown person inside each of them is our hope for the future, wrote Korczak. If we take Janusz Korczak's wisdom to heart, when we contemplate businesses' human rights obligations, we must surely also ask specifically, what are businesses' impacts on children's rights? And how do we go about preventing corporate abuses of kids' rights?